So this morning, we are preparing the way. And this morning, mostly we want to think about what John said he was doing, which was a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And it's just a phrase that's always worth unpacking a little bit. We recognize these days that we are very much worshiping in the shadow of COVID-19. So we've taken time this morning for prayer and time for sadness and time for grief. Hopefully you've had some time to rest this morning. And also we try to make sense of the old stories and the traditions in this time. That Christmas is about these traditions. It's about these old stories. At the same time that it's about the new dreams. It's about what is coming, what God is still doing and what God will do. And I think we can wrap this all up by saying we still preach a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. So we start with baptism. We start with getting clean, which is what baptism is all about. And if you grew up with thoughts about original sin, just sort of leave those behind for now and think about baptism as an opportunity for a fresh start. To go into the water as one person and come out of the water as someone else. And we know it's symbolic because John was baptizing in the Jordan River. And being baptized in the Jordan River and expecting to be physically cleaner is sort of like going into Decker's Creek and expecting to come out cleaner. Yeah, you might wash off some of the dirt, but you don't really want to think about what you're just picking up at the same time, right? So this is all very symbolic. And to understand this baptism that hopefully most of you have experienced as an ongoing battle, right? Just like you need to shower on a regular basis, so you need to understand this baptism as something that is part of your life in an ongoing way. It means, right, that when you go into the water of baptism, you have left behind, you have to keep on leaving behind the old ways of being and thinking. And that even means leaving behind old habits of faith. That a lot of Christian growth involves leaving behind not just the worldly stuff, but the parts of faith that we inherited that, well, it would have been nice if we hadn't. When we meet as a men's group to do our book study, we spent some time one week talking about guilt. And some of the people in the group mentioned that guilt was a big part of their growing up. This was sort of the foundation of faith, was feeling guilty about stuff, and even feeling guilty about feeling guilty, or feeling guilty about not feeling guilty. And that's one of those things that you just have to leave behind because you've been washed clean. And if you're clean, you're clean. And guilty is not clean. And this is especially important for religious folks like us, right? I know some of you might not think of yourself as religious folks, but let's face it, it's Sunday morning and you're here. That makes you pretty religious because, you could still be sleeping, but here you are. And we know it's important for religious folks because if we've been reading Matthew's story rather than Mark's story, Matthew continues on by noticing that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that the most religious folks of Jesus' larger community, coming also to John the Baptist to be baptized, right? And John the Baptist says to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath that is to come?" Right? They're most religious folks of his day, right? And so us too, right? We also need to be clean. So that's where we start. We start by getting clean, this ongoing process. And it's a baptism of repentance, which means that repentance is the first step of preparation. If we're going to prepare the way, we have to start by repenting. And so this morning, I want us to think about repentance as a form of self-care. There's lots of stuff out there these days about self-care, and some of it's just dumb, and some of it's really good. And it's worth hanging on to the really good stuff. And hopefully repentance for you is part of the really good stuff. Now, again, some of you have immediately gone back to guilt because repentance is all about feeling guilty for stuff. but that's not what repentance is about. Because the word we should really be using here is turning. Repentance is about turning. John is preaching a baptism of turning, right? Whether it's, right? So it's about the future, not about the past. And it's about turning away from certain things and turning toward others, but mostly toward. Right? Now, again, sometimes this turning toward means turning toward the old ways, because there are some parts of the old ways that are worth turning toward, lots of parts that aren't. Right? So we've noticed during this time of COVID that we've turned back to some of the old ways. We've turned back to reading books. We've turned back to cooking and canning and gardening. We've turned back to having time for hobbies, for making stuff with our hands. Maybe we've even turned back to reading the Bible. So there are things, right, about the old ways that are worth recovering. At the same time, right, this self-care involves turning toward new ways. There's stuff in the past we don't want to go back to. We want to move to a place beyond race, beyond this artificial construction of a race. We want to move beyond waste. We want to move toward caring more than consuming. So there's lots of parts of the new that we want to move toward, and parts of the old that we want to move back to. And the church then becomes a community of those who are preparing. Prepare the way of the Lord. That's our task. And it's an ongoing task, right? This preparing, and we need to support one another in this task. So this is a baptism of turning for forgiveness. And in order for that to work, you have to be forgiven. Now, one way of thinking about that is yes, right? God will forgive you. But the other side of it is you have to accept that forgiveness. You have to live out that forgiveness. You have to take hold of that forgiveness and live that way as a forgiven person. Right? A lot of you probably have to work first on forgiving yourself for either stuff you've done or the kind of person you are or whatever it is. So you start there at the same time that you recognize that you have been forgiven by God. You have been forgiven by God. And if God has forgiven you, right, then you're clean. All part of the same package. The trickier thing in all of this, the hard thing in all of this, is that Jesus said that God will not forgive you until you have forgiven others. And that one's hard. That's hard because there are people out there who don't deserve to be forgiven. There are people out there that we're not ready to forgive. There's situations out there that don't really call for forgiveness yet because the steps haven't been taken to make that happen. Right? Steps like the repentance of the other, the actual turning. If other people haven't done the turning, then they haven't done the repentance, and then they are not ready to be forgiven. It's really not your task to forgive someone who's not there yet. Right? And yet there's this goal. Or maybe to think about it as trying to get yourself ready to give the other person the opportunity to be forgiven if they are ready and if we are ready. Right? Because forgiving others includes their repentance. Here's the way Denise Anderson put it. The call to repentance is a call to those who are hurting us to cease and desist. It is a peace order of sorts and an amnesty program. Those who have trespassed against us are being offered a chance to stop. When they take advantage of that opportunity, we find our own respite. Repentance means not just stopping the current trajectory, but also turning back, addressing the damage left in one's wake, and vowing never to go down that road again. When our oppressor repents, we can be free. John prepares for us the way for the Lord. Like a prophetic GPS device, he highlights not only the route for us to take, but also the place for the Lord to come in, telling us when we need to make a U-turn. So this is part of the task, this task of being forgiven and being forgiving. And then, right, this whole task, repentance, right, baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, also expands outward. We need to understand this as a positive move, as our little positive move for everyone else. It is something that we recommend to our friends. Hey, look, you could be clean. You could be forgiven. You could forgive yourself. You could forgive others. Think about how much better that would be. Right? We can offer it to our enemies. Right? This is getting really tricky and really hard here. Right? But right, if you wanted an easy answer to stuff, you came to the wrong place anyway. So we have this challenge, and it's not going to end soon. It's going to follow us the rest of our lives. This challenge to enact, to live out the baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. It is step one in preparing the way. Hopefully we'll get through step one, I don't know, at some point, so we're ready for steps two, or we'll just keep it all as part of the same work. That's the challenge for this week. And that's the sermon for this week.